Well, hello and welcome to another Essential Implementation podcast. In today's episode, I had the pleasure of speaking to Dr. Bijal Balasubramanian. Bijal is a primary care physician, also professor in epidemiology and director of the University of Texas Health Institute for Implementation. Bijal has always been interested in combining what she's learned from epidemiology and from being a primary care physician to improving primary care practice. Now, I first came across Bijal via this paper called Learning Evaluation, Blending Quality Improvement and Implementation Research Methods to Study Healthcare Innovations. Now, I think this paper was well before its time, 2015, and Bijal and her colleagues were talking about blending quality improvement and implementation research methods. They actually lay out 5 key learning evaluation principles that you can use when you're doing an evaluation to actually capture that on-the-ground learning about the implementation process that's often lost in our evaluations. Now, I'd had Laura Damschroeder on the podcast before, and she'd spoken about the powerful combination of improvement science and implementation science. So I was therefore very interested to speak to Bijal about how she came up with the idea to use that combination in an evaluation of implementation. So we started off talking about the paper, but very quickly got into further discussion on the system and policy barriers to implementation, the importance of form versus function, and important questions such as, could research be causing burnout, and how far do the systems we work in actually support or work against research and implementation? So, hello, and welcome to the Essential Implementation Podcast.
Thank you. Thank you so much. I really appreciate this opportunity. I've never done a podcast before, so okay. We'll go with it. I didn't see any interest in that paper for maybe 4, 5, 6 years. And more recently, it's come back in different ways. You've been one person, but even in other forums, in conferences that I've been going to, there's like this interest now of what's this integration of quality improvement and implementation science, which is what that paper was about. So it's been an interesting story and learning from this idea that something that may be very intuitive to some people may not be either intuitive or maybe it's a question that others didn't ask. So they didn't really have the clarity that, oh, wow, that this can be done. And I kind of feel like in retrospect, that's kind of what happened. We asked the question and yes. We were able to write up something about it, and it's now connecting with people.
So it's lovely to hear that you're getting more interest around it. And I think as people start to realize, I think we need to be having impact, don't we? How can we actually influence outcomes?
For sure. I think there's also this other field that's been named called learning healthcare systems for practitioners, right? Yes. I think that's coming together because of this need for real pragmatic, on the ground methods, if you may, to improve practice, but to do it in a deliberate, systematic fashion, not kind of whatever I feel works, right? And that's where, again, the methods to combine the fields together, the framework, the learning evaluation framework, one of the things that it did for us is because we were able to see several practices, we learned what was working in one context and why it wasn't working in another context, but also how it could benefit, the different contexts could benefit from learning about each other, which is where being an evaluator, we had a little bit of distance from it to be able to see it and observe it and learn from it. What are those ways that we can bridge and get actionable knowledge to frontline practitioners where they do develop a little bit of this, let's reflect on what's working, what's not working in their usual practice. And I think that's the piece that we still have not worked. I think the system, and I don't know a ton about the UK health system, but I don't imagine it's very different from the US health system, where practitioners are really focused on seeing patients and getting reimbursed in whichever form to see patients. And the systems are not incentivizing this idea that to actually continue to improve and do better and see more patients, the practitioners and health and practices and clinics and systems will need to take a step back, reflect on what's working and what's not working. That is, in fact, investment and will probably have returns on that investment to the health system. And I think maybe as researchers, we need to do more to prove that actually works. While the work that we are talking about, this bridging and integrating, it makes intuitive sense. I think there aren't incentives built in to do it, and that's why we don't do it.
This is fantastic, because I've been having exactly the same thoughts, particularly recently. I guess there's two angles I've come at this from. One is, well, if we're saying how can we have more impact, right? With how can we make sure things are implemented better and then get better outcomes? Because like most of the time things aren't implemented well. That's the reality. Very complex systems, unpredictable. So the first sort of approach was, well, let's evolve how we do research. So that's why I loved your paper and the way you think about this, because we're saying, yes, we're still going to use a lot of follow the scientific process, be methodologically rigorous, but we're going to combine that with improvement practices and things like that to actually make sure people can do implementation. But I do think as well, that is definitely going to help. But then it's the system that you've then got to deal with. So I'm glad you mentioned the system, because I agree with you. I don't think our current healthcare systems are actually supportive of learning in a way. That people like practitioners aren't given any time to say do a PDSA cycle every week, or have a huddle every week. They're always got to be with the patients usually. So have you had any further thoughts on how we might be able to tackle that?
Yeah, well, that is a tough question. And I know that a lot of people are working in that space and trying to address that question from different angles. I personally think that the way to go about it is to start small. To start with the practices or the practitioners that really appreciate that, and then show the success stories. So for example, I'm currently working with two practices in the Houston, Texas area that are predominantly serving in the US this uninsured, underinsured population. They don't have a consistent source of healthcare access or health insurance. And the interest currently that I have is, and I interviewed two physicians yesterday for a project. The interest I currently have is related to the number of people who have cancer and are surviving with it for many, many, many years, right? And at some point, when they are cancer-free for many years, cancer is another chronic condition that they have to continue to manage. I have to get my surveillance test. I have to, eat healthy. I have to lose weight. I should quit my tobacco use, so on and so forth. Yeah. And what is happening is those patients, I know that this is a problem in many countries. Those patients are really sort of caught between, do I keep going to my oncologist or do I go back to primary care? And there isn't real understanding of that. And so the reason I bring that example out in this context is that these two practices, they have a pretty large burden of patients who have cancer and are extremely motivated to start thinking about how can they, as primary care homes for these patients, help provide better, comprehensive, whole person care where cancer becomes one of the things that they're managing. And in primary care, this is not front and center for them. And I think that that's exactly the kind of context that we start learning and demonstrate how they can do quality improvement, how I can use implementation methods to show how they are making these practice changes and have these success stories in this space. And so you can imagine, Christian, I am extrapolating or predicting that this problem of survivors in primary care, cancer survivors in primary care, in 10 years is going to be a very big problem. In the US, we're already at about 17 million survivors living with cancer patients now, which is just increasing everywhere in the world because we have so many great technologies and people are just living longer. So where are they going to go? And so I'm particularly interested in this quality improvement implementation research in integration in this space now, which that paper, if you remember, was focused more on integrating behavioral health in primary care. So even the topic area is important for saying where is the integration most useful in that current sense. So a sidebar story, but I think that goes to say that we need to find the systems that are the forward-thinking systems, who'll say, yes, investing in this will help in the future. So, I mean, that sort of is the challenge. And I kind of feel like talking about small p or big P policy is a little bit outside of the scope of my comfort, and I haven't really gotten there. But that's the other work we need to do. We need to get our systems and policymakers to start valuing the importance of doing improvement and implementation within practicing systems.
I couldn't agree more. It's by trying and doing, isn't it, that we'll learn. We'll get that juicy, practical implementation knowledge. I think I loved your, you called it within system innovation.
Right.
And that needs to be generated. And at the moment, I think our research, a lot of research, although it's great, isn't really generating that. It's generating a lot of generalizable academic knowledge, a lot of problem analysis. We had Johan, I know I keep name dropping in this interview, but it all relates, you see. It's like a story. All the interviews I've done build up to this one. So Johan Faizi, climate change professor, saying that all the papers are just talking about the problem of climate change and only a fraction about implementing solutions. Why is that? Because nobody's actually trying to implement solutions in a research and researching it. So you're saying, go and find receptive sites, I imagine, that have the motivation, that have the capacity, that want to do it, think it's a good idea, and work with them. I know Trish Greenhalgh in one of her papers I was reading the other day, there's a framework she's made. I don't know if you know it. There's over 100, isn't there? We can't know them all. The NAS framework, really interesting. But she's saying, we should be doing these rich case studies because every setting, as you say, is different. It's complex. So do these rich case studies, all the workarounds, all the little intuitive, creative changes. So, and just to kind of sort of relate to it again, what you're saying about big P and small p policies, a big P one in England is, equality, right? And that's a great idea. Everyone needs to get the same thing. So I'll be on a project sometimes and then people will be saying, well, we need to give this to everybody. But we know if you've actually tried to implement, it works better if you can find, like I say, those receptive teams that are ready for it, and then do it there, learn what you can. And then as you did in your paper in 2015, you transportable findings can then take them.
Yes.
Yeah.
So since we're name dropping, I'll drop Kurt Stenge. The word transportable versus, in contrast to generalizable, is something I learned from Kurt Stenge, who was the founding editor of Annals of Family Medicine. And he's a brilliant epidemiologist and primary care physician who really helped me think that, are we really interested when we talk about practice change? Are we really interested in generalizability? Because generalizability is a statistical concept in some ways. Or are we interested in transportability? What can I transport from this practice change effort to another practice change effort? And it was a light bulb that went on in my head. I'm like, that is exactly what I need. I'm more interested in. And along the way, once you start identifying those transportable features from one innovation to another innovation, you are creating generalizable knowledge. But I think people tend to not understand that nuance between transportability and generalizability. And in academic research, generalizability makes sense. Well, you did it in this kind of practice. Can it be done in all kinds of practices? Of course not, because context is different. So that was. I'm glad you caught on to that word, because it was a major shift in the way I started thinking about practice change and practice change in different contexts.
Yeah, absolutely. No, I really I like that idea as well. It feels like people are slowly realizing. It's amazing again how we've still got quite a way to go, I think, because you might be speaking to, I mean, I've got experience of speaking to funders, people that are going to fund research, or somebody. So let's say we've implemented something really well. We've done one of these case studies that we were sort of describing here. We've approached a receptive team, like with the cancer patients in primary care you were talking about. You go through a process of learning. You learn lots of within system innovation from that, and you get some transportable findings. But you know how you've got the risk then. You might take that to a new healthcare system. In England, it might be, we call them integrated care boards now, and there's lots of them around the country. So you might go to a new ICB and you say, so this is an intervention you could use. It's worked really well. And often they'll say, okay, give us the business case and we'll just copy it. That's the generalizable approach, isn't it? It's saying one size will fit. You've shown it works here. It'll work everywhere. No, it won't. We need to, like you say, transport it. So what we'll say to them is, no. We won't give you the business case, but we'll tell you how to build your own.
Right.
So again, improvement cycles.
Yeah.
Like
that's great. I hadn't heard of the ICBs, but two reflections on what you just said. One is this idea of a business case, which is fascinating to me, that I want to talk about perhaps at a different time. But Brian Mittman has started a conversation and wrote a couple of papers around forms and functions of interventions, which has also helped me think about this transportability. Because I think intervention research has often focused on a thing, a form. Here's an app, or here's a registry, or like a thing that you say, well, we tried it out, we tested it, it works, it's effective. Now take this registry, put it somewhere else. The problem is that somewhere else, it may not be the registry that works. It may, but the function the registry performs could be done through some other form. And that's been something that I've been thinking about a lot when I think about practice change or write some new grants, which is, what is the problem that we're trying to address, for which what function needs to change? And then for that context, what's the form in which that function can be addressed? So if you're trying to make a business case, for example, you might say sort of the same rubric, like what's the issue? And while this intervention used this form, the idea is fix this function that's not working, and use a form that's most relevant and sustainable in your practice, rather than picking this form and trying to spend millions of dollars and pounds and euros to put in a new form that doesn't actually integrate with your practice. So that's sort of is something we also need to be thinking about.
I didn't know it was Brian Mittman that had written a paper on that, because I really like Penny Hawes. She's from Australia. She's been sort of arguing of the need to allow for adaptation, in trials for like 17 years. I think she just retired, unfortunately, but she's still kind of giving talks and things. But she talks about fidelity to function instead of fidelity to form, which is pretty much so it can look different. You can have the same intervention in many places and it can look different in each one, as long as it's still functioning the same. So I understand. And so do you have this? I mean, I always try to make sure that whoever we're working with, we all agree, what's the goal of this thing? What are we trying to achieve? And then we say, okay, so we know what the problem is. We know what we're trying to achieve, but we also now say we're going to allow for this creativity and tweaking to get there, right? So it's like a tight, loose, tight rule,
Yeah. Well, what is your experiment? So I know it doesn't matter. I'll ask you the question anyways.
Sure.
What is your experience with respect to researchers proposing a question to ask of a practice versus the issue coming from the practice around which a researcher develops a project? I bring this up because I'm constantly struggling with what I think of, and again, stuff that's been written about, the push of research versus the pull of practice. And where's that equilibrium? Because I don't find that our practices necessarily are saying, oh, let me identify problems for you to fix, because they don't have anyone to go to. And we have a lot of researchers who are coming up with questions they want to ask of practices that are not ready because they don't have the capacity. And so sometimes it's like you just paralysis, like, what do we do? So it'd be great to hear your thoughts or your experience in that space.
Thank you, Bijal. It's actually the first time I think somebody's asked me a question on the podcast, which actually is really nice. And I think that is such a good question. The thing is, the reality is we're in a situation where it's a very complex systems, way beyond anything we can fully probably understand anymore, or even control. I don't think anyone has control of our healthcare systems in terms of total control, because it's just so many different actors. But it's clear that my view is that, researchers will have their own kind of needs and wants and interests, and practice has their own needs and wants and interests, and executives and managers and the patients. All these different stakeholders have different needs, wants, agendas, there's nothing wrong with that. I think our job is often to get them to all empathize. But as far as I'm concerned in the UK, we really need to be asking practice what it needs, what it wants, what it needs to research. Unfortunately, our healthcare systems were struggling before the pandemic. Now they're even worse. We've had 40,000 nurses in the last year leave alone. People are leaving. Now, then you've got research teams approaching these very stressed teams and saying, oh, we're doing a research project. This is an example I heard recently. What's positive about being involved in research? Can we interview you about that? It's like, we don't have the privilege to do that kind of research anymore. We need to be asking them what they need, research to help them fix their problems, to make their service better. So I think that's the way I see it, but I'd love to hear what you think.
No, I agree with you. I mean, there is, in community-based research, there is community-based participatory research where when I was learning about it, that is exactly, I remember this very distinctly. You're going to go to a community and say, what are your problems? And if none of their problems that they bring up align with what you want to study, you're in a bit of a pickle. But that doesn't mean that you just say, well, no, I want to study diabetes. And while your problem, you have diabetes in your community as a problem, but their main problem is violence in schools. It's just not going to jive, And if we keep sort of pushing on the diabetes front of it, then we're not going to get these communities engaged in the work that we're doing. I mean, it's not a good use of resources. It's frustrating. You really don't learn from it. And perhaps you even end up doing them harm. So I think I remember that from studying CBPR in grad school. But that is exactly the same thing that's happening with our health systems. They don't have the capacity. And we need to come in with providing them with support and resources to address the upstream or more foundational problems they have first, to improve capacity or increase capacity before we get to the next step. And that doesn't align practically with the funding cycles, right? We don't get 2 years of funding to increase capacity and then say, now go and do this other thing. So I think that there's something to be said here about funders also paying attention to the reality of the problem.
At the moment, I just don't think we're working together enough,
Right.
Yeah.
I agree. And I think, again, bringing it full circle back, that's why the integration of implementation research code with improvement practice might be that middle ground, right? You don't go in saying, I want to implement something. You go in and say, well, how can we address some of the challenges? And as I just thought of something, so often in clinical practice, when you're trying to implement, let's say colorectal cancer screening and you want to increase it, the improvement practice tools can actually help more than just colorectal cancer screening, right? If they figure out how to find those patients who are eligible for colorectal cancer screening, they probably can use the same tools to find patients eligible for any kind of cancer screening. And so I think that showing that generalist perspective to a practitioner can be another way to engage them and explain, well, the funder is interested in this, but there is more you can do with this improvement practice tool if you use it, and then you can in addition to what we're doing. So I've been very interested also in that sense of practices are not, they don't, no practitioner comes to work and says, today is my colorectal cancer screening day, right? So they have to keep integrating everything that they do with a patient and so how can we provide them tools that are a little more generalizable and that they can use towards multiple targets? I think continuing to think along those lines can help develop methods and tools that are just a lot more easier for practices to use rather than this one disease at a time, one condition at a time approach that we often do in research.
Yeah. So again, that's kind of thinking, it's evolving really how we do research, because we're not just researching a thing. We're now thinking, how can we research something, but also help give the people in practice what they really need, or something that can help them. So it becomes a two-way exchange. And I will send you, we've got a draft paper we put together. We've drawn from your learning evaluation principles, but we've combined it with a thing called lightning reports, which it's a way of rapid qualitative analysis. Have you heard of lightning reports before?
Well, I've heard of rapid qualitative analysis, and
Yes.
I love the name lightning reports. I think that's that kind of real-time feedback that helps practices. I would love to read this paper, and so excited to hear that you're finding that my paper so useful and advancing it, making it better. It's amazing.
Well, I'm not surprised that you resonate with the idea. Well, you get the rapid qualitative analysis, because I agree. We can follow learning evaluation principles, we can do improvement, but in real time, they're just a very simple way that you can, literally on a weekly basis, if you want, just quickly talk to the people 5-10 minutes each who are involved in implementation, and put together these 1 or 2 page reports. They look nice, but it's helpful for them too. So we get what we need to see what's going on, to learn, capture that within system innovation, but we're also giving them something back, which is kind of like a weekly or bi-weekly record of how things are going, what's not going so well, any key insights, and they can then just choose what to do with that information. And it's also a clever way to, give them a bit of time to away from the patients and problem solve. Yeah.
And I'm sure that they appreciate it. So in that project and multiple projects after that, every time they've gotten feedback that gives them a second to reflect on their day, I find practitioners really appreciate it. And I'll add another concept, another thing that I worked on a different project with someone else who led this work, but how that ability to reflect can actually mitigate burnout in physicians. It is huge, because they're burnt out from just being on the treadmill of seeing patient after patient after patient, and you take them back and engage them in how can your life be better? How can you yourself have some autonomy and influence? And it's through this reflection on quality improvement, and that was really fascinating. And I don't think a lot of people are really talking about that.
No, it's a wonderful point. We've got somebody that works in patient safety, Rebecca Lawton, who's based at the Bradford Institute for Health Research as well. And she wrote a really fascinating editorial on, I can't remember the exact title now. I'll put it up on the screen when I edit this, but it was on quality improvement and how useful is it? And it's the idea that, when you try to engage teams in quality improvement, that it could actually backfire. It could just add to their burnout and not actually help. And I think it's the same with research, that, trying to engage teams in research, again, could just add to their burnout. So I think it's nice. It's lovely to hear how you were thinking about that, and how when you engage them, how you're doing things that actually help. So yes, giving them a chance to just reflect on their day is a nice thing to do. And I can understand how that would reduce burnout. And actually, I was thinking that applying the learning evaluation principles, but to de-implementation, like trying to help, lighten the load on these people. Let's stop just implementing one thing after another. Let's start taking things out they don't want or need anymore.
Right. And things that are not working, let's get them out of your stuff that you just do every day, which imagine one small thing that you do every day and you take it away because it's not working makes a big difference.
Yeah.
So I appreciate that. Yeah.
I think we've really put the world to rights. We've been talking for 40 minutes straight, and actually, normally
I didn't even realize that, but yeah.
What a great conversation. I'm just thinking if there's anywhere else we wanted to take it, or if there's anything else you wanted to bring in, or do you think we've really?
I think this was a great conversation. I think perhaps to sum it up, it would be really interesting to see what is the global application of this kind of thing in public health, in emerging health systems. So I'm from India, and India's healthcare system has been kind of like, there's some infrastructure, but it's otherwise a mess, and the country is globally, it's changing so rapidly. And so imagine the scale at which something like this could be done in emerging healthcare systems, or changing fundamentally healthcare systems. So that's something that I spent a little bit of time dreaming about, but I'm not in a space right now to be working at that level. But perhaps a reflection paper or something on the application of this learning evaluation, and at least the principles behind the learning evaluation for healthcare systems that are still forming would be fantastic.
I agree. I feel like there's a kind of two ways that we could deal with the work, the sort of two approaches that are taken generally around healthcare. And one is to mandate more centralized control, top down, and that's clearly going on quite a lot. The other is you kind of recognize local knowledge and expertise, and you empower individuals locally to make decisions and do what's best for them. And then the job of the researcher or the funder is to really just support that and empower them. Again, I think it would reduce burnout as well. I think, telling clinicians going into work and suddenly being told, you've got to change this and do this without any engagement is stressful. Whereas if you say, look, how's it going? What do you need? Do you want to do some research on this? That's perhaps the way to go. And I think at the moment, all these different stakeholders and systems, and it's kind of a big jumble, but if they could somehow get together, and that was the common idea, that we're going to just empower, maybe that would help. And I'm with you, it's a massive issue, but we've got to start somewhere, I guess.
Yeah, I agree. All right. Well, I think this was fantastic, and I agree with you that we could be talking about this for another couple of hours. So many different ways to do this.
Well, thank you for coming on the podcast. Maybe we'll see you again sometime, and I will put some links below if people want to find out more about your work or get in touch. They can do. Okay. All right. Well, Bijal, look, I hope you have a great weekend. And it was so nice to do this. Thanks a lot.
Thank you. No, thank you for your time and really the opportunity. I really enjoyed it.
Great. All right. See you soon. Okay.
Bye.
Bye.